The corridors of Blackwood Hall echoed with the steady rhythm of footsteps, the sounds dampened by thick, ornate carpets. Sunlight streamed through tall windows framed by heavy crimson curtains, casting long shadows on the marble floors. The smell of polished wood, old books, and faint traces of laundry soap lingered in the air, a scent both familiar and oppressive. Mira Langdon walked briskly down the hallway, a laundry basket balanced on her hip. At 29, she had worked as a dormitory assistant at Blackwood Hall for almost 5 years. Her job was simple on paper: keep the boys' boarding rooms in order, ensure uniforms were laundered, and teach basic life skills where she could. But in practice, it was more than that. It was managing chaos, mediating minor teenage disputes, and sometimes being a quiet confidant when homesickness or personal struggles weighed too heavily on young shoulders. The brass nameplate on the next door read Room 214, a number she knew all too well. She exhaled, bracing herself as she knocked. "Oliver?" she called through the door. "It's Mira. Time to check on your laundry." There was a muffled sound from within. Then the door swung open to reveal Oliver Fairfax, a 17-year-old boy with disheveled blonde hair, a crisp school blazer half slipping off his shoulders, and an expression that hovered somewhere between boredom and irritation. His green eyes met hers, fleetingly vulnerable before his usual mask of indifference slid into place. "Oh," he said, not bothering to hide his sigh. "You again?" "Yes, me again," Mira replied, her voice even. She pushed past him gently and entered the room. The air inside was stale, with a faint, unpleasant odor creeping from the corner. And there it was, a massive suitcase crammed with dirty clothes, zippers barely able to hold the chaos inside. Socks peeked out from the sides, a stained rugby shirt lay tangled with a formal tie, and crumpled trousers sat like defeated soldiers at the bottom. Mira pinched the bridge of her nose. "Oliver," she said, exasperation clear in her tone. "We talked about this. You can't keep doing this." He shrugged, flopping onto his unmade bed. "I don't see the problem. The maids handle it when I go home. Why bother learning something I don't need?" His words, spoken with casual disdain, stung more than they should have. Mira clenched her jaw, forcing down the irritation bubbling inside her. She reminded herself of what she knew about Oliver Fairfax. Heir to a family fortune, parents too busy with corporate empires to notice the boy left in their wake. A child who had everything except the things that truly mattered. "That's not the point," she said, her voice softer now. "Learning to care for yourself isn't about need. It's about respect, for yourself and others." Oliver scoffed. "Why should I care about laundry when I'm going to inherit? Because one day, you might not have someone to do it for you." The words slipped out sharper than she intended. A flash of something, hurt, maybe, crossed Oliver's face before his expression hardened again. He crossed his arms, staring out the window. Mira sighed, the fight draining out of her. This was a dance they had done many times before, each encounter following the same weary rhythm. She knew he wasn't a bad kid, just lost, shielded by layers of privilege that both protected and isolated him. "Come on," she said gently, gesturing toward the suitcase. "I'll teach you. It's not hard. And maybe, just maybe, it'll surprise you how satisfying it is to do something for yourself." He didn't move, his gaze still fixed on the window. For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. A silence that felt brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from a place deeper than his 17 years, he got up. "Fine," he muttered. "But if I mess this up, it's on you." A smile tugged at the corner of Mira's lips. "Deal." She led him down to the laundry room in the basement of the old building, the faint hum of machines greeting them as they descended the creaking stairs. The room smelled of detergent and damp air, the walls lined with gleaming white washing machines that seemed at odds with the building's antiquated charm. Oliver stood awkwardly beside a machine, his hands shoved into his pockets. Mira opened his suitcase and began sorting the clothes, separating colors from whites, delicate fabrics from sturdy ones. "First lesson," she said, holding up a rugby jersey. Don't mix colors and whites unless you want everything to turn a lovely shade of pink. He raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a threat? Consider it a warning, she replied, a smirk slipping through. Now watch closely, as she explained the steps. Loading the machine, measuring detergent, selecting the right settings. Oliver listened, his initial reluctance softening into quiet curiosity. He fumbled through the motions, his brow furrowed in concentration. When the machine finally whirred to life, he stepped back, a faint flush of pride coloring his cheeks. There, Mira said, giving him a nod. Not so bad, is it? He looked away, trying to hide the small smile that betrayed him. I guess not. She leaned against the counter, her eyes softening. You know, Oliver, it's not just about the clothes. It's about knowing you can take care of yourself. That you matter enough to do that. His eyes flicked to hers, something vulnerable slipping through the cracks of his defenses. But before he could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed down the stairs. They turned to see another student enter, casting a curious glance their way before disappearing into the maze of machines. The moment was gone. Oliver shoved his hands back into his pockets, his voice back to its usual casual indifference. Thanks, I guess. I'll figure out the rest. Mira smiled, though her heart ached a little. I know you will. As she turned to leave, she glanced back, watching as he stared at the churning machine, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, she thought, it's the smallest victories that matter the most. She climbed the stairs, the scent of detergent lingering in the air, and for the first time in a long while, hope fluttered in her chest, fragile, but real. The laundry room door closed behind Mira with a soft click, the sounds of whirring machines fading as she ascended the stairs. The cold air of Blackwood Hall's corridors greeted her, carrying the echoes of distant laughter and shuffling feet. Outside, dusk had settled, casting long shadows through the tall windows. Her mind replayed the moment with Oliver. The flicker of pride on his face as the washing machine hummed to life, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. There was something about him that struck a chord deep within her, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was more like recognition, a mirror reflecting her own younger self, lost and searching for something real in a world that felt indifferent. As she turned the corner to head back to her quarters, she almost collided with Mrs. Whitlock, the head of the dormitory staff. The older woman, her iron-gray hair twisted into a tight bun, gave Mira a disapproving glance, her sharp eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. Miss Langdon, Mrs. Whitlock said in her clipped, formal tone. I trust you've finished your duties for the evening? Yes, Mrs. Whitlock, Mira replied, forcing a polite smile. I was just helping one of the students with his laundry. Mrs. Whitlock's lips pursed. I hope you're not wasting too much time on Fairfax. Myra's smile faltered. He's learning. Some boys never learn, Miss Langdon. Mrs. Whitlock's voice was cold, dismissive. That boy's head is too full of privilege to leave room for anything useful. You're better off focusing your efforts elsewhere. Myra's jaw tightened. Sometimes, all someone needs is a little patience. Mrs. Whitlock's eyes narrowed further, her gaze like a blade. Patience is a luxury we can't always afford. With that, she swept down the hall, her footsteps precise and unyielding. Mira watched her go, a flare of defiance warming her chest. People aren't lost causes, she thought. But Mrs. Whitlock's words hung heavily in the air, like a cloud that refused to lift. That night, Mira lay awake in her small, sparsely furnished room. The wind rattled the window panes, and the old pipes groaned somewhere in the walls. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind a tangle of memories and doubts. Some boys never learn. The phrase grated on her. Had people once thought the same of her? A girl who'd grown up in foster care, shuffled from one home to the next, her life dictated by forms and case files. She remembered the teachers who'd given up on her, the adults who'd dismissed her as too much trouble. But she also remembered the ones who hadn't, the rare souls who'd seen something worth saving. Maybe that was why she couldn't give up on Oliver. Beneath his entitled facade, she sensed a loneliness she recognized, a yearning for something beyond wealth and expectation. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at her door. Frowning, she sat up and glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. Who would be visiting this late? She opened the door to find Oliver standing there, his blazer gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked younger without the usual armor of his uniform, his eyes darting away as if ashamed of being there. "Oliver?" she asked, surprised. "Is everything okay?" He shifted on his feet, his hands jammed into his pockets. "Yeah, I just wanted to show you something." Curiosity flared. "Okay, come in." He stepped inside hesitantly, his gaze scanning her modest room, the neatly made bed, the stack of books by the window, the framed photo of her younger self standing with her first foster family. He cleared his throat and pulled something out of his pocket. It was a small, crumpled note. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. She unfolded the paper and read the scrawled handwriting. "Mum says she's proud of me. She says I've become so handy." A lump formed in her throat. She looked up at Oliver, who was studying the floor like it held the secrets of the universe. "She's never said that to me before," he mumbled. "Not once." Mira's heart clenched. The pride in the note was painfully genuine, a tiny affirmation that seemed to mean the world to him. She could imagine his mother, distant, distracted, finally acknowledging something he'd done, something that made him feel seen. "That's wonderful, Oliver," she said softly. "You should be proud." He glanced up, his eyes shimmering with an emotion he quickly hid behind a smirk. "It's just laundry," he muttered. "Not like I cured a disease." "It's more than laundry," Mira said gently. "It's the fact that you tried, that you did it yourself. Sometimes the smallest things are the ones that matter most." He shrugged, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward. "I guess." A silence settled between them, the kind that felt full, not empty. Mira's eyes searched his face, seeing not the spoiled, indifferent boy everyone else saw, but a teenager caught between expectation and desire, between who he was and who he wanted to be. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "for not giving up on me." The words hit her like a wave. She blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. "You're worth it, Oliver." He nodded, awkward and unsure, but there was a lightness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. He turned to leave, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "Good night, Mira." "Good night, Oliver." The door clicked shut, and Mira sank onto her bed, the note still clutched in her hand. Tears slipped down her cheeks, a mixture of sadness and hope. In that tiny exchange, something had shifted, not just for Oliver, but for her as well. They were both learning, both reaching for something more. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all. Mira watched the door click shut, the quiet of her room returning like a blanket. The note, still crumpled in her hand, seemed to radiate warmth. Oliver's words echoed in her mind. "For not giving up on me." She hadn't realized how deeply she'd needed to hear that. A reminder that the small things she did mattered to someone. Sleep came in fits and starts that night, her dreams restless and fragmented. By the time her alarm clock buzzed, she was already awake, staring at the thin light seeping through the curtains. "It's just another day," she told herself. But something felt different, like the pieces of her routine had shifted ever so slightly. She walked the halls of Blackwood Hall with a newfound alertness, her eyes searching for Oliver among the blur of navy blazers and polished shoes. She spotted him at breakfast, sitting at the far end of the dining hall, a group of boys laughing around him. He was quiet, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate, his face a mask of nonchalance. But then he looked up. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She returned it, a thread of understanding passing between them. The day's chores were routine: making beds, tidying rooms, sorting uniforms. Mira worked quickly, her thoughts drifting back to Oliver's quiet breakthrough. But by mid-morning, a new tension hung in the air, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until she entered the common room that she understood why. A group of students were huddled around the bulletin board, their voices low and anxious. Mira's stomach twisted. Gossip and rumors spread like wildfire at Blackwood Hall, often leaving ruin in their wake. "Did you hear?" a boy whispered to his friend. "Oliver Fairfax got a letter from his parents. They're not coming for the holidays." Mira's heart dropped. "No way," the other boy replied. "They always take him to that villa in Italy. Not this year. He's staying here. Alone." The words were casual, almost careless, but they struck Mira like a physical blow. The holidays were only a week away. Blackwood Hall would soon be empty, the grand old building falling into a lonely silence as the students returned to their families. But Oliver would remain, left behind in the vast, echoing halls. Alone. She turned and left the common room, her steps quickening as she headed for the dormitory. Oliver's door was ajar, and she found him inside, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the half-packed suitcase by his feet. His eyes flicked up to meet hers. The mask of indifference was firmly in place, but it was cracking at the edges. "Oliver," she said gently, stepping inside. "Is it true?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal." He clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists on his knees. "They said something came up. Business, I guess." His voice was bitter, brittle. "They're sending someone to the villa instead. Probably clients or investors." Mira's heart ached. "I'm so sorry." He laughed, the sound hollow. "Don't be. I'm used to it." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. She moved closer, sitting beside him on the bed. The silence stretched, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. "I know it hurts," she said softly. "Even if you're used to it, it doesn't stop hurting." He didn't answer, but his shoulders slumped. The bravado slipped away, leaving behind a boy who felt forgotten by the people who were supposed to love him most. "Sometimes," he whispered, "I think they'd be happier if I wasn't around." The words were like a knife to Mira's heart. She knew that feeling, the gnawing sense that you were more of a burden than a blessing. The fear that your existence was an inconvenience. She swallowed hard, her voice steady. "You matter, Oliver. You matter more than you know." He looked at her, his green eyes glassy with tears he refused to shed. "Why do you care?" "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know how easy it is to believe that you're alone. But you're not." A tear slid down his cheek, and he wiped it away angrily. "It doesn't change anything." "No," she agreed, "but it changes how you see yourself. And that matters." He took a shaky breath, the weight of his hurt pressing down on him. "What am I supposed to do? Just sit here and pretend it doesn't matter?" "No," she said firmly. "You don't have to pretend. You can be angry. You can be hurt. But you can also decide that their choices don't define who you are." He nodded slowly, the fight in his eyes dimming to a quiet resolve. "It just feels like, no matter what I do, it's never enough." Mira's heart clenched. "You're enough, Oliver, just as you are." He looked at her, something raw and desperate in his gaze. "How do you know?" "Because I've been where you are, and I know how hard it is to believe it. But I'm here, and I'll keep reminding you until you do." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, with a shuddering breath, he whispered, "Thank you." Mira squeezed his shoulder, a fragile hope blooming in the space between them. They sat together in the quiet room, the shadows deepening outside. Two souls, seemingly unconnected, bound by the invisible threads of shared pain and the need for someone to say, "You are not alone." The days leading up to the holiday break passed in a blur of routine, but beneath the surface, everything felt different. The grand halls of Blackwood Hall were quieter now, the usual chatter replaced by the low murmur of students preparing to leave for the holidays. Suitcases lined the dormitory corridors, polished shoes clicked with anticipation, and excited voices filled the air with plans for family gatherings and winter trips abroad. But for Oliver Fairfax, the world remained muted. His footsteps echoed with a hollow sound, His usual air of aloof confidence dimmed to a quiet resignation. He no longer hid behind barbed words or disinterested shrugs. Instead, he seemed distant, his gaze lost in thoughts he couldn't share. Mira noticed the change, each day deepening her worry. The memory of his quiet confession haunted her. "Sometimes I think they'd be happier if I wasn't around." The words clung to her heart like a bruise, aching whenever she thought of him sitting alone in the empty dorms, swallowed by silence. On the final day before the break, the students filtered out one by one, the grand oak doors of Blackwood Hall swinging open and closed with a steady rhythm. Parents arrived in sleek cars, drivers loaded trunks with polished luggage, and the air buzzed with joyful reunions. Mira stood at the top of the stone steps, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted Oliver leaning against a pillar, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He watched the goodbyes with a distant expression, his jaw set tight, as if each hug and smile chipped away at his composure. Her chest tightened. She walked over, the wind tugging at her coat as she approached. "Hey," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes dull, the shadows under them more pronounced. "Hey, any chance you'll let me convince you to come inside for some hot chocolate?" she offered, a small smile playing on her lips. He shrugged. "Why not? Got nothing better to do." They walked together back into the building, the warmth inside a sharp contrast to the cold winds outside. The common room, once filled with noise and movement, felt cavernous and still. Mira set 2 mugs of hot chocolate on the coffee table, the rich aroma curling in the air between them. Oliver sank into an armchair, staring into the steam rising from his mug. "It's weird," he muttered. "It's like the whole place is holding its breath." Mira nodded, settling into the chair across from him. "It always feels like that when everyone leaves, like the walls are waiting for them to come back." He gave a hollow laugh. "Except no one's coming back for me." The ache in his voice pierced her. She leaned forward, her eyes searching his. "That doesn't mean you have to be alone." He looked at her, his defenses wavering. "What am I supposed to do? Pretend I don't care that they left me behind?" "No," she said firmly. "But you don't have to let it define you either. Your parents' choices don't decide your worth, Oliver. You do." He stared into his hot chocolate, the tension in his shoulders trembling. "It just feels like everyone expects me to be someone I'm not. And when I fail, it's like I don't matter." Her heart clenched. The walls he had so carefully built around himself were starting to crack, and she could see the scared, hurting boy inside. She knew that feeling, the crushing weight of expectation, the fear of not being enough. "Oliver," she said softly, "I know what it's like to feel that way, to believe that if you can't be what everyone wants, you'll disappear. But you're not invisible. You're not worthless. And you're not alone." His eyes glistened, but he blinked quickly, fighting back the tears. "It doesn't feel that way." She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm, grounding him. "I see you. I know it doesn't fix everything, but I promise you, you matter to me." A tear slid down his cheek, and this time he didn't wipe it away. His voice was a shaky whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Her own eyes stung. "Because someone once cared about me when I felt like you do now, and it saved me." He looked at her, vulnerability naked on his face. The silence between them stretched, full of pain, hope, and the fragile beginnings of trust. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. They both turned as Mrs. Whitlock appeared in the doorway, her sharp gaze flicking between them. "Miss Langdon," she said, her voice cool. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Myra's stomach tightened. She squeezed Oliver's hand once before letting go. "I'll be right back," she whispered. She followed Mrs. Whitlock into the hall. The older woman's face was pinched with disapproval. "You're getting too close," she said bluntly. "It's not your job to play therapist. He needs discipline, not sympathy." Myra's jaw clenched. "What he needs is someone who doesn't give up on him." Mrs. Whitlock's eyes hardened. "This isn't a charity, Miss Langdon. Remember your place." Anger flared in Myra's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "With all due respect, I know what I'm doing. Mrs. Whitlock studied her, lips pursed. Careful, Miss Langdon. Attachment leads to disappointment. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Mira trembling with frustration. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then she went back to the common room. Oliver was still there, his eyes wary. Everything okay? She smiled, though her heart felt heavy. Yeah, everything's fine. He nodded, but his eyes searched hers, as if sensing the storm beneath the surface. They sat in silence, the quiet wrapping around them like a fragile cocoon. In that moment, Mira knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't give up on him, no matter what. The winter wind howled against the windows of Blackwood Hall, the old building creaking like an ancient ship bracing for a storm. The grand halls were empty now, their silence a reminder of absence rather than peace. The students had left for the holidays, their laughter and footsteps replaced by an eerie stillness. Oliver's room felt colder than usual. The radiator clinked and hissed, but its warmth barely touched the chill seeping into the corners. He sat at his desk, staring at the half-packed suitcase by his bed, a cruel reminder of plans that no longer mattered. The weight of his parents' abandonment sat heavily on his shoulders. Mira's words replayed in his mind, a fragile thread holding him together. You're enough, Oliver, just as you are. He wanted to believe her, but how could he, when the two people who were supposed to love him the most couldn't even bother to show up? The knock at his door was so soft he almost didn't hear it. He turned, expecting Mrs. Whitlock's cold, judgmental gaze. Instead, Mira stood there, her face gentle, her brown eyes filled with quiet determination. Hey, she said softly. Mind some company? He shrugged, masking the relief that bloomed in his chest. Sure. It's not like I have anything better to do. She smiled, closing the door behind her. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things unsaid. Want to go for a walk? She suggested. Clear your head. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, why not? The grounds of Blackwood Hall were a vast, frozen expanse of frost-tipped grass and leafless trees stretching toward the overcast sky. Their breath curled in the frigid air, mingling with the low whistle of the wind. The crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path was the only sound, each step marking their presence in the stillness. They walked in silence, the cold biting at their cheeks. Oliver shoved his hands into his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The world felt so open, yet he felt trapped, locked inside an invisible cage of expectations and disappointments. After a while, Mira spoke, her voice low. Do you remember the first time we met? He smirked faintly. You mean when you yelled at me for shoving my dirty clothes into a suitcase? She laughed softly, the sound warm despite the chill. I wasn't yelling. I was strongly advising. He glanced at her, his expression softening. You were right, though, about all of it. Her smile faded. Oliver, I didn't just mean the laundry. I meant taking care of yourself, knowing you're worth the effort. He swallowed hard, the words scraping against the hurt lodged in his chest. Sometimes it feels like no one else thinks I'm worth it. They reached an old wooden bench near the edge of the grounds. Mira brushed off the thin layer of frost and sat down. Oliver hesitated, then joined her, his gaze fixed on the barren trees. Can I tell you a story? She asked, her voice gentle. He nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. When I was 12, she began, I lived with a foster family. They weren't bad people, but they never made me feel like I belonged. I was always on the edge, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. She paused, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. One winter, they forgot to pick me up from school. I waited outside in the cold until it got dark. I kept telling myself they'd come, that they just got stuck in traffic or lost track of time. But they never came. Oliver's jaw tightened. What happened? A teacher found me, she said, her voice tight with the memory. She brought me inside, gave me a blanket and hot chocolate, and she told me something I've never forgotten. You matter, even when it feels like no one sees you. She turned to look at him, her eyes shimmering. That's what I want you to know, Oliver. Just because they don't show up for you doesn't mean you don't matter. Your worth isn't decided by their failures. He looked away, his throat tight. But it still hurts. I know, she whispered. And it's okay to hurt. But you don't have to carry that hurt alone. He clenched his fists in his pockets, his shoulders shaking slightly. What if I'm not enough? What if I can't be what they want? She reached out, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. You don't have to be what they want. You just have to be you. And that's enough. His defenses crumbled. A tear slid down his cheek, followed by another. He didn't wipe them away this time. The storm of pain he'd kept locked inside finally broke free, and he let it come. Mira stayed beside him, her presence a steady anchor as the floodgates opened. After a while, the tears slowed, leaving him feeling hollow but strangely lighter. He took a shaky breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. Thank you, he whispered, his voice raw. Mira squeezed his shoulder gently. You're not alone, Oliver. I promise. They sat together in the freezing quiet, the wind swirling around them, but the cold no longer felt so sharp. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with understanding, with the fragile hope of healing. And for the first time, Oliver felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry his burdens alone. The sun broke through the gray clouds the following morning, its pale rays filtering through the windows of Blackwood Hall. The golden light touched the ancient stone walls, casting long beams across the empty corridors. The quiet of the old building felt different now. Not eerie, but restful, like a deep breath held and finally exhaled. Mira made her way to the dormitory, her footsteps soft against the worn carpet. Her heart felt lighter, but cautious, as if afraid the fragile progress she'd made with Oliver would vanish like morning mist. When she reached his door, she hesitated for a moment before knocking. Come in, his voice called out, low but steady. She pushed the door open to find Oliver standing by the window, gazing out at the frost-tipped grounds. He was dressed casually, his blazer replaced by a simple sweater, his hair tousled from sleep. The suitcase that had been half-packed yesterday was now empty, clothes neatly folded back in the drawers. He turned to her, and for the first time, there was no mask, no bravado, just Oliver, raw and unguarded. Hey, he said, a small but genuine smile touching his lips. Hey, she replied, a warmth spreading in her chest. You unpacked. He shrugged, his fingers tapping the windowsill. Figured there wasn't much point pretending I was leaving. Mira nodded, stepping inside. The room felt brighter somehow, as if the sunlight had managed to seep into the cracks of the walls, dispelling some of the gloom. She met his gaze, searching for the hurt that usually hid behind his eyes. It was still there, but it no longer held him captive. I was thinking, he said, his voice careful. Maybe we could decorate the common room, for the holidays. Her brows lifted in surprise. Decorate? He nodded, his gaze flicking away, suddenly shy. Yeah, just because I'm staying doesn't mean it has to feel empty. A smile bloomed across her face. I think that's a great idea. His shoulders eased, the hint of relief clear in his eyes. I thought maybe it could feel a little more like home. Her chest tightened, a mix of joy and sorrow swelling inside her. Home. The word carried so much weight, so much hope. Let's do it, she said softly. They spent the afternoon in the common room, pulling dusty boxes of decorations from a forgotten storage closet. Old tinsel, faded ornaments, and strings of colored lights spilled out around them. The scent of cinnamon and pine drifted through the room as Mira brewed spiced tea, filling the space with warmth. Oliver wrestled with a tangled string of lights, his brow furrowed in concentration. How did these even get this messed up? Mira laughed, kneeling beside him to help. It's a mystery no one has ever solved. Together, they unwound the knots, the lights flickering to life one by one. The glow reflected in Oliver's eyes, a quiet joy replacing the shadows that had lingered there for so long. They hung the lights along the bookshelves and windows, draped tinsel over the mantel, and placed a small, artificial tree in the corner. Oliver carefully hung each ornament, his fingers lingering on the delicate glass shapes. Mira watched him, her heart swelling with pride. When they were finished, they stepped back to admire their work. The room, once cold and empty, now glowed with color and light. The decorations weren't perfect. The tinsel hung a little unevenly, and one strand of lights flickered stubbornly. But it felt real, and that was enough. Oliver exhaled slowly, his breath almost a sigh of disbelief. It actually looks nice. It looks wonderful, Mira corrected, her voice warm. Because you made it that way. He turned to her, vulnerability and gratitude shining in his eyes. I wouldn't have done it without you. She shook her head gently. You did more than you think, Oliver. You chose to make something better. That takes courage. A faint blush crept up his cheeks, but he didn't look away. Thank you, Mira, for everything. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling through the warmth in her chest. You're welcome. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, filled not with emptiness, but with understanding. The cracks in their walls, the wounds left by abandonment and doubt, weren't gone, but they were healing. And for now, that was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the glow of their decorations cast soft shadows on the walls, they sat in the common room, sipping hot chocolate. The warmth of the mugs seeped into their fingers, the quiet crackle of a fire filling the space with comfort. Oliver leaned back in his chair, a piece Mira hadn't seen before settling over him. It's strange, he murmured. For the first time, it doesn't feel so bad to be here. She smiled, her heart full. That's because you let yourself be seen, and you let yourself belong. He nodded, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips. Maybe being left behind doesn't mean being forgotten. No, Mira agreed. It doesn't. They sat in the gentle glow of the lights, two souls who had found each other in the cold. The storm of loneliness had passed, leaving behind a quiet hope, fragile, but real. And as the night settled around Blackwood Hall, it no longer felt like a place of absence. It felt like a place where healing had begun, where walls had cracked just enough to let the light in. And maybe, for now, that was all they needed.